All right, good evening. Appreciate you being here this evening, coming out and finding your way here. Um, I've been out for a couple of weeks, spring break, and then some other things, and so we're going to pick up tonight with the story of Gideon. We finished Judges chapter 7, and we're going to go to Judges 8 tonight. Gideon is at the pinnacle. That young boy that was so pathetic in the early parts of the story, the one that was called a mighty man of valor, even though there was absolutely no reason to expect that he was ever going to amount to anything, that young man has now, with a mere 300 soldiers, not even a full army, has routed an army of upwards of 135,000 soldiers. Now, I say he's routed an army. We all know that God did this so that he could take credit and teach Israel where their reliance should be. But in Judges chapter 8, we're going to pick up in the middle of that battle. The victory is basically assured, but the Midianites are in complete retreat, and the 300 men of Gideon are in pursuit. But at the same time that they're in pursuit, Gideon now sends out a call to other tribes to send out people to help in the chase. The goal is to eliminate a Midianite presence in Israel's spaces, in Israel's land, entirely. The only way that we see, periodically in the book of Judges, we see a judge raised up. He leads the people to the deliverance that God is providing. And then there's a summary that says, and the land had peace for X number of years. Well, peace only comes when the enemy is routed. And so that's what's happening in this chapter. Napoleon Bonaparte, at one point, toward the end of his career, made this statement that I think is applicable to the story of Gideon. Napoleon said, "The skill of a general is never so critically tested as in deciding how to turn a victory to the best advantage." In other words, winning the victory in the field is only the setup for what has to happen in the life of a nation after that. So as chapter 8 lets us finish the battle, sort of rout the Midianites and bring deliverance fully to Israel, part of the reason that the writer of Judges gives us such detail about Gideon when we don't have this much detail for some of the other judges is because Gideon's life has such a laundry list of lessons that we're supposed to learn. So rather than routing the Midianites and simply having a summary verse that said Israel had peace for X number of years, we're going to actually follow the story of Gideon because he's going to have 4 tests of leadership. We're going to look at 2 of them tonight, and we're going to look at the other 2 of them next week. And we're going to see that Gideon, according to Napoleon, Gideon in some ways proves his maturity as a leader by handling the test that we're going to look at tonight in really a powerful and proper way. I wish the story could end here. We're going to come back next week and we're going to look at the final 2 tests that come to Gideon as a leader. And we're going to see that for all that God did through him, Gideon is going to prove to be, in the end, a cautionary tale because he doesn't end as well as we would have hoped. So let's start back at the end of chapter 7. You know the story. They have the 300 men. They had the jars of clay. They had the trumpets. They shouted. They frightened the Midianites who were thrown into chaos, and they began to retreat. Let's just pick up with verse 24 of chapter 7 because this is going to take us back to the middle of the battle where Gideon begins to summon other tribes to send men to help in this cleanup campaign of routing the Midianites and completely eradicating them from the territory of Israel. Chapter 7, verse 24. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against Midian and take control of the waters ahead of them, as far as Beth Barah and the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took control of the waters as far as Beth Barah and the Jordan. And they captured the two leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and they killed Zeb at the winepress of Zeb, while they pursued Midian. And they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon from across the Jordan. All right, if you think that's a little graphic, wait till we get to chapter 8. But what we have here is the 300 are pursuing this retreating army. The Midianites still haven't figured out that there's only 300 men behind them. But as they're running away, he sends messengers who summon the Ephraimites, because that's the territory that they're entering. Go take control of the escape routes so that we can pin them in and we can destroy this army. So in fact, that's what they do. The Ephraimites capture two of the kings. Now, there are two kings mentioned in chapter 7. We're going to see the other two Midianite kings mentioned in chapter 8. But the Ephraimites capture those two kings and execute them, actually bring their heads back to Gideon. Now, you would think they would be celebrating in Israel, but this is where the first test comes in. Gideon is really an overnight celebrity. I mean, from the boy who broke down an idol in the dead of night and upset all of the city leaders, he is now leading a very tiny army, but clearly with the hand of God on his life, and he has routed the Midianites. Remember, there's been 7 years of one harvest after another being completely taken over and carried away by the Midianites. There hasn't been a decent meal in Israel in 7 years. They work all year, Midianites come and steal the harvest. Now the army is on the run, and at least 2 of the kings have now been killed. And so when we come to chapter 8, we're going to find that for all of his immediate celebrity, his status as an instant hero, the first test of leadership, and everyone who's ever served in a leadership capacity has been through this test at least. It is the test of criticism. Look at chapter 8. Then the men of Ephraim said to Gideon, "What is this thing that you have done to us, not calling upon us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they quarreled with him vehemently. But he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim not better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has handed over to you the leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and what was I able to do in comparison with you?" Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. It's interesting, this test of criticism is the way a leader handles what happens when when you're criticized because you mess up, that's one thing. But what really chaps a leader is when he's criticized when he has succeeded, when what he has done has actually been a great thing. It has accomplished something significant. What you'll notice in this exchange, which is, the translation here says they quarreled with him vehemently. What that means is this was a serious conversation. They were desperately angry at him. What happened was, as they continued the pursuit and chased the Midianite army, the goal was to make sure that no Midianites remained in Israelite territory. So they summoned Ephraim, who came and joined the army by cutting off these retreat routes. They succeeded in what came to be known as the slaughter of Oreb. Now, it's interesting. Later in biblical history, I'll give you 2 references if you're interested. In Psalm 83, verse 9, the psalmist speaks to God in a prayer asking that God would defend Israel. And in Psalm 83, verse 9, he says, "Defend Israel like when you destroyed Oreb and Zeb." In Psalm 83, verse 11, He's going to mention a prayer to God to act in the same way as when he destroyed the other two kings that are now mentioned in chapter 8, Zebah and Zalmunna. These become sort of historical moments that the psalmist could look back on and say, defend your people like you did in the days of Gideon. Isaiah chapter 10, verse 26, the prophet, even later than the psalmist, refers to this very battle to point out the faithfulness of God and the way that God protected his people against the enemies, Oreb, Zebah, and Zalmunna, these four Midianite kings. This was such a historically significant victory that it became kind of a watchword, a byword, that later Israelites would build into their prayers and ask God to do again what he did here. God accomplished precisely what he wanted. For all the rest of Israel's history, this battle is not associated with Gideon so much as it is associated with the supernatural deliverance of God. That's a success. But Gideon has to take the brunt of this battle. What happens is the Ephraimites appear to be jealous of their late invitation to participate. This was clearly a deeply felt and bitter exchange, but they come to Gideon and say, and now see, this is what happens with criticism. They weren't standing in line to join the army when there were 135,000 Midianites. But now that the victory is secured, they're mad that they didn't get in on more of the glory. They're just a part of the mop-up routine. Why didn't you call us? You prevented us from participating in this historic event that we should have been a part of. One writer that I really like put it this way. He said, in every church there are Ephraimites. They are the people who, no matter what happens in the church, they feel constantly put upon. They're hard workers, but when they get little recognition, when they're called to cope with emergencies, when they don't get the praise that they think they deserve, they always are in danger of having a wounded pride which degenerates into a pity party. The poor little old me syndrome. Those are the Ephraimites. We should have gotten the praise and the glory for this, but you Gideon, you hogged it all to yourself. Now, it's interesting because this business about leadership, there are two ways that the devil comes at leaders. He comes at them with criticism, and he comes at them with praise. And they are, in their own ways, equally dangerous attacks. Criticism pushes a leader to often feel like he has to justify himself. He has to defend himself. That's not fair. You're not evaluating me properly. Did you see what I did? It accomplished something great. You can't criticize me. I've had times in my life where I begged God to let me fight a fight in the church. I mean, I'll just be real straightforward with you. I'd love to say that I've been like Jesus every minute of every day of my whole life. But there have been times when I said, God, I can win this fight. I've got the people. I've got the support. You know, if you'll let me take this to that group, I can clean this up. And I remember one of the significant moments in my own life, in my own walk with the Lord. I had an unmistakable sense in my spirit of God saying, Gabbert, do you trust me with your reputation? If you don't, knock yourself out. You'll probably win the fight, but you'll have a shell of a church left. Or you can keep your mouth shut and you can trust me and you'll see what I can do. Gideon is faced with one of those moments. He's just defeated the Midianites. And here are these latecomers who weren't anywhere to be found when he was trying to recruit an army. And now they're put out because they don't get more of the glory. Gideon handles this in a remarkably different way. Oh, I was going to read you a quote from Charles Spurgeon for the other battle, the praise battle. And I love this. I try and remember this sometimes. Charles Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers in the 19th century, probably the greatest Baptist preacher in history. The story is told of a woman who approached him after a sermon, an over-effusive admirer. And she came up to him after the sermon, what was by every account a particularly brilliant sermon. And she said, "Oh, Mr. Spurgeon, you were wonderful." To which that old preacher replied, "Madam, the devil whispered those same words in my ear as I stepped down from the pulpit." You were wonderful. Well, that's not what they were saying to Gideon. They were criticizing him because he didn't let them be a part. But look at the way he dealt with this test of criticism. He pointed to God's activity in the victory, and then he pointed to the magnitude of the successes of the contributions that the Ephraimites made. He didn't take any personal offense at the criticism, and he didn't take any personal credit for the victory in the field. I mean, look what he says. He says, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim not better than the vintage of Abiezer?" In other words, just pulling the grapes off in Ephraim is better than the finished wine that comes from where I come from. He said, "God has handed over to you the leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and what was I able to do in comparison with you?" This is a real mark of leadership, because Gideon diffuses the criticism, what could have developed maybe even to the degree of a civil war. He diffuses Ephraim's complaint by, in humility, saying, I'm not sure what you're talking about. You're worried about not getting enough glory, and yet your contribution, even coming late, is so much more significant than anything I did. I mean, we smashed a few pots, we blew a few trumpets, we yelled in the night, and then we just chased an army that was running away. But you met them face to face in their retreat and captured 2 kings and cut off their heads. Nobody has more glory in this battle than the tribe of Ephraim. That's a powerful example of a leader who trusts God with his reputation and doesn't feel obligated to defend himself from unjust criticisms. Well, the next is the test of non-cooperation. Let's look at an extended passage here, beginning in verse 4. Then Gideon and the 300 men who were with him came to the Jordan and crossed over, exhausted, yet still pursuing. And he said to the men of Succoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who are following me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the leaders of Succoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?" So Gideon said, "For this answer, when the Lord has handed over to me Zebah and Zalmunna, I will thrash your bodies with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." Then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke similarly to them, and the men of Penuel answered him just as the men of Succoth had answered. So he said also to the men of Penuel, "When I return safely, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000 men, all who were left of the entire army of the people of the east. For the fallen were 120,000 swordsmen. All right? This 135,000 man army is now down to 15,000 men. But when you think about it, the odds are still 15,000 to 300. They come up and they meet him. Verse 11, Gideon went up by the way of those who lived in tents to the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and he attacked the camp when the camp was unsuspecting. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and captured the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the entire army. Then Gideon the son of Joash returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres. And he captured a youth from Succoth and questioned him. Then the youth wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth and said, Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are weary? Then he took the elders of the city and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and he disciplined the men of Succoth with them. And he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. Now we'll get to his judgment on the Midianite kings, but let's talk about this. What I've called the test of non-cooperation. This is the practical side of the pursuit. The pursuit has to be complete. Midian has to be totally eliminated. That's the only way to guarantee permanent relief from the Midianite oppressors. So his band of 300 continues the pursuit. They are headed towards where the last remnants of the Midianite army are camping, where they're trying to regather, where they're trying to recreate units under the leadership of the remaining 2 kings in this 4-king alliance. And he comes to the people of Succoth. Now, Succoth and Penuel, these are both Israelite villages. These are brothers, certainly from a different tribe, but still Israelites. There should have been an obvious connection there. But he comes to first of all, to Succoth, and he says, Listen, my men are exhausted, and they could really use some food. Would you feed my men? And the taunt was, do you have these other 2 Midianite kings in your hands yet? You see, what they were saying is, we're not going to show any favoritism towards the Israel army as long as there's a chance that the Midianites come back and know that we've taken a side. They were covering their own backsides, if you will. They were hedging their bets, probably because with a lack of faith, they were still measuring 15,000 soldiers against 300 soldiers. And so they had kind of a sullen non-cooperation. Sure, we're going to help you. That's all we need, to be on the bad side of the Midianites, like they haven't caused us enough grief. Gideon says, okay, when I win this war and those kings are out of the picture, I'm going to come back here. What do we call the leader of Israel during this time period? A judge. I'm going to come back here and I'm going to issue a judgment on your non-cooperation, your lack of participation in this battle. So he goes on to the next village, a village by the name of Penuel, and he says the same thing. Hey, my men could really use some food. Can you help us? And basically they answered in the same way. We're not going to get on the bad side of the Midianites. That is not the way to survive around here. You have to keep a low profile. You have to fly under the radar. You have to be sure that the Midianites don't get any madder at you than they already are. So I'm sorry, we can't help you. Just move on down the road. He says, okay, when I come back this way, I'm going to tear down your tower. Now, the tower was simply probably the signature structure in this village. It would have been probably the watchtower for all of the agricultural lands around the village in every direction. It would have been the warning post that would let them know when invaders were coming. It would have been able to identify when wild animals were ravaging the crops. It would have been the tallest and probably the most significant building in the village. Gideon says, I'm going to come back this way. I'm going to tear down this tower. They probably, from a human perspective, you can say, well, they're just hedging their bets. You know, it's probably not a smart move to go with the 300 when you still have the 15,000, when you've been ravaged by Midianites year after year after year. But see, the problem here is their insults and their taunts towards Gideon, reveal that not only were they forsaking their loyalty to Gideon as an Israelite brother, I mean, there should have been a reasonable expectation that they would know which side to land on in this conflict. But not only their loyalty that should have been to Gideon, but frankly, their loyalty to the God of Israel. I mean, even if there's 15,000 soldiers down the road, there's 120,000 dead bodies up the road. God's already shown that he's got this day. It belongs to him. Sukkoth and Peniel were filled with people who had the same lack of faith, the same refusal to depend on God that had gotten Israel in this cycle of God allowing an oppressor to come in so that they would finally be desperate enough to cry out for him to save them. And yet, we've got two villages that even with everything that's happened, they're still not desperate enough to depend on God. They're still hedging their bets. They're still playing this game that says, I don't want to make the Midianites mad. You don't want to make them mad. We want to eliminate them altogether. That's what God has called, that's what God has raised up a deliverer for in this generation. You see, when Gideon does circle back, he follows the army, he attacks the army. As the two kings try and escape, he captures those two kings and he executes them. Well, not yet, but he captures them and brings them back. And so as they have slaughtered the army, and remember, we've already explored the ethics of all of this. When God says, this is a judicial act of my judgment, we are not being godly to say that we're more merciful than God, so we don't want to push it all the way to that extreme. When God says the time for judgment is here, the time for mercy has passed, Israel in that moment becomes the instrument of judgment. Gideon understood that in a way that a lot of leaders throughout this period of Israel's history failed to understand. Partial obedience is the same as complete disobedience. God has said, rout this army. And so that's what he does. Now, when he comes back with the captured kings, I think he doesn't execute them at the time because he wants to bring them to these two villages and show them off. Are the hands of those kings in your hands? Well, hello, guess what? Actually, they are. They're right here. They're in chains and they're being marched back to the place of judgment. The denial of these two villages, the denial of their ties of blood, of their loyalty to the nation, because it came out of the fact that they were clearly more concerned with their self. They were actually assisting the enemies of God by choosing to stand on the sidelines. That's a lesson I think that is significant even for our generation. I don't know how many pastors that I've talked to, they say, we just don't take sides on political issues. We don't talk about social issues. It's too divisive. Here's what you have to understand. Going all the way back to Jesus, Jesus says there's two camps. There's the camp that's with me, and there's the camp that's against me. And this idea that we can somehow be so godly that we don't get our hands dirty in the real life interactions between good and evil, salt has to touch decay before it's useful. Light has to bump up against darkness in order for it to be useful. It's the definition of what it means to be a man of God, a woman of God in the world. In the world, not of the world. This is a classic character example of this mindset that says, I prefer not to get involved. When you refuse to get involved against evil by standing for good, you are actually assisting the enemies of God. It's like There are a lot of people that are bothered. I've told you before, it makes me laugh, this idea that songs like Onward Christian Soldiers are somehow not appropriate. Years ago in another church, we put a Bible verse on the church sign, and it was a Bible verse out of the Proverbs about the three things God hates. God hates three things, and he hates these four things. We put that Bible verse on the sign. I got a call from a woman that was not a part of our church. She was just driving by on the street. Went home, looked up our church, called the phone number, asked for the pastor, and she said, it is not appropriate for you to put a message of hate on your sign. I said, well, it's not my message. It's actually a quotation from the Bible about God's attitude towards sin. She goes, well, I think it's inappropriate. I've taught my children that we don't hate anything. I said, well, ma'am, here's the thing. You clearly think that you're more merciful and gracious than God. But if you teach your children never to hate anything, you're going to be disappointed one day by the things they embrace. Listen, you can use the sensitivity or politically correct language all you want, but the bottom line is, it's serious business when God says, I hate this. And the only proper attitude towards that is to hate what God hates. What's happening here is just the opposite. They were so concerned with themselves, they preferred to not be involved. What they displayed was a lack of faith, first of all, in the Lord's power and protection, but this was essentially the same unbelief that originally started the Midianite problem 7 years before. Nothing had changed in these two villages. Now, what happens is, in verses 16 and 17, we have this punishment that Gideon is going to mete out. He comes back and he does exactly what he promised them he would do. He comes to Sukkoth and he takes the elders of the city and he takes thorny branches and he basically whips them in public. You say, man, that kind of talk makes me uncomfortable. Okay, but I want you to understand, he was the judge. He is executing a judicial sentence for the people of God who have rebelled against the instructions of God to participate in the judgment of God on the enemies of God. Well, he goes to Penuel, and it says he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. You say, well, man, Gideon is, he's pretty sensitive. Now, this is why the writer, we think that Samuel is the author of the book of Judges. This is why in this detail of the life of Gideon, I think that's why in chapter 8, we're given the test of criticism first and then the test of non-cooperation. Because if we only had this episode, you might be able to say, well, Gideon is a little petty. I mean, Gideon took this personally and he used his authority. He overstepped his standing. I mean, he killed these people. No, the test of criticism shows us that Gideon was humble in the exertion of his authority, in the way he played out his leadership. He accommodated the wrong attitudes of the Ephraimites to diffuse the situation so that everybody could come together and be on the same page. We're given that test to show specifically that in the next test, Gideon is not acting out of spite or out of personal offense. He is acting in his official capacity as a judge. And what this calls for is when there are only two sides to an issue, these two villages chose by their lack of involvement, they chose to stand with Midian. So they earned the punishment of the judgment of God that was given to Midian. That's what this comes down to. You know, what people don't understand today is whether it is a judgment that comes in our human circumstances today or a judgment that takes place in the presence of God in eternity. You got to pick your side. Are we the people of God? Or are we living by our own self-determined agendas, just hoping to sort of slip into heaven unnoticed? That ain't happening. So we look at Gideon and go, man, it makes me uncomfortable the way he executed judgment here. But that's exactly what he's doing. He's executing judgment. It's an official, legal, right capacity. It's no different than a judge in our culture who sits on a bench and issues a verdict with a sentencing that is carried out. That's what Gideon is doing here. Now, he's dealt with the rebellious Israelites. Verse 18. Then Gideon said to Zebah and Zalmunna, "Where were the men whom you killed at Tabor?" But they said, "You and they were alike, each one resembling the son of a king." Now here's what happens. He calls out, I think it's interesting, these two kings, they probably don't have much hope for themselves because they've just seen Gideon execute judgment on Israelites. So Midianite kings are not going to have much hope for mercy here. But he asked a question that I think caught them off guard. He said, there was a battle at Tabor, and you killed some men there. The Midianites did. And they said, you know, now that you mention it, you look a lot like the men that we killed. In fact, each one of them had the presentation, they had the bearing of the son of a king. And Gideon said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if only you had let them live, I would not kill you. So he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise, kill them. But the youth did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise up yourself and attack us, for as the man, so is his strength. I guess when you know you're down to your last couple of minutes, false bravado, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a thing. See how this unfolds. Gideon says, and I can't really reconcile this because I'm not sure Gideon had the permission to not execute these kings. But he seems to suggest if you hadn't done this crime of actually murdering my own family, I might have let you live. But see, Oreb and Zeb, they were executed because it was the execution of an enemy in war that's justified. Now, this is going to be the execution of an enemy in war as well. Unlike the judgment against the Israelite villages, that was a judicial sentence carried out by a judge. What's about to happen is this is a judgment executed as a general over hostile forces. But it's just a little added twist to this story that he doesn't simply execute them as opposing kings. These particular kings, there's a personal stake here for Gideon. My brothers, the sons of my mother, you killed them. I might have been inclined to consider mercy, but not now. And he does an interesting thing. He turns to his firstborn son and he says, you execute these two kings. Now, I've tried to process that. I've looked at different commentaries and nobody's really given me a satisfactory answer here. I wonder if Gideon is basically trying to develop the the backbone in his son that he's had to develop. From that sort of pathetic beginning that he had to now a man who is the conquering ruler, who's executing and exercising judgment over Israel. He turns to his son, he says, execute these men. Now, it wouldn't have been murder because it is a military execution of the enemy kings. There's no Geneva Convention in the ancient world. You know, like a captain goes down with his ship, the king goes down with his army. You lose the battle, you don't get to go home. He tells his son, kill them, and the boy doesn't pull his sword because it says he's just a youth. In other words, he's intimidated. Being a part of the army, that's one thing, but an unchallenged execution of an unarmed man, even though it is legally proper, I think he just didn't have it in him. He didn't have the maturity or the self-confidence to do that. Well, seeing the reluctance of the boy, these two kings, in their false bravado, they taunt Gideon, rise up yourself and attack us, for as the man, so is his strength. In other words, you're so tough, why don't you do it? Okay. So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna and took the crescent amulets which were on their camels' necks. This judgment was the execution by one general over hostile forces. It's interesting that that little tidbit there is recorded and probably was there for 1,000 years before it became truly significant. He killed these two Midianite, these pagan enemies of Israel, and he removed from their camels the symbol of their royal authority. Their symbol was an amulet in the shape of a crescent. Now, the reason that's fascinating to me is because what is the symbol of Islam? It is the crescent moon. Listen, Islam was born in the 7th century AD. That's when Muhammad invented this new religion. He plagiarized the Bible. He plagiarized the Torah. He wrote some other things with really poor spelling and then attributed it to an angel. And he tried to come up with this new revelation and create a new religion. This religion was supposed to be for a warrior God who demanded that his people forcibly take control of the world so that everybody would bow the knee to this dominant one God. But what I want you to see is, while Islam started with Muhammad in the 7th century AD, it is not a new religion. It was the latest permutation, the latest version of opposing religions that go all the way back 1,000 years before that, of people who stood against the chosen people of God and battled for the Middle East, the Promised Land. There may have been 1,000 years where people looked at that verse and said, oh, yeah, it took their crescent-shaped amulets. That was the authority of their kingship. But for us, it's a historical interest because it reminds us that this sworn enemy of the people of God didn't start with Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad's kind of a chump. He just came up with the latest version of a satanically inspired opposition to the people of God that went back centuries before that. The symbols never change. Well, what can we draw out of this passage about Gideon? This passage marks Gideon's peak. His power, his prestige, His positive influence in Israel is at an all-time high. He has been persistent to do the work of God. He's faced physical dangers and hardships. He's faced opposition and lack of participation from those whom he might have reasonably expected to support and encourage him. He was, in all of this, what we have seen so far in 5 weeks of walking through this story of Gideon, he was a man of faith. I mean, think back through the whole story. He had within himself the evidence and the conviction of things not seen. Remember Hebrews chapter 11, that's the definition of faith. Gideon was a man who believed in the divine calling of the Israelite people, in the theocracy or the rule of God. You remember, even when Gideon was at his lamest, when he was first discovered, there wasn't much to commend him as a hero. But even then, the angel comes and he says, hey, God's chosen you. And he goes, well, where's God been all this time? You know, he believed that God was in charge. He believed that Israel was the chosen people, that this was the promised land. Chosen, promise, those are the kinds of words you only use if you have confidence that God didn't topple off the throne. World events are not out of control. We're the chosen people. This is the promised land. And yet we don't feel very chosen, and this doesn't look like much of a promise. Where's God in all of this? Even that criticism of God is a statement of faith. Because he hadn't shrugged his shoulders and said, oh, well, you know, it is what it is. He was angry at Israel's situation because he believed by faith that this is not how things are supposed to be. Listen, we have this weird idea that if we get mad at God, that he's going to just topple off of his throne and run crying into the night. The prophet Jeremiah, we call Jeremiah the weeping prophet. Did you know that? That's the name that's been given to him. If you've ever read the book of Jeremiah, you realize that he wasn't weeping out of sadness. He was weeping out of hurt and anger. He was given a 40-year ministry of preaching judgment that never quite seemed to come. God has this pesky habit of announcing that judgment is coming and then extending mercy just a little bit longer. But judgment is coming, but I'm going to give a little more mercy. But judgment is coming, but it's not yet. Jeremiah gets to the place where he hates delivering these messages of judgment because he feels like he's never been vindicated. The way you judge a prophet is 100% correct all the time. When you say God said this, it better be something God said. Because in the Old Testament, you were subject to capital execution if you lied using the name of God to justify whatever it was you were saying. He had a 40-year track record of preaching judgment that never seemed to show up. And we get to Jeremiah chapter 20, which, by the way, the book of Jeremiah is not written in chronological order. So the fact that it's in chapter 20 doesn't mean that it didn't happen much later in the story. But we get to Jeremiah chapter 20, and Jeremiah has had enough. I mean, he is fed up. And he is furious at God. So much so that we have to translate the Hebrew of Jeremiah chapter 20 gently. We translate it into English with words not as sharp as the words Jeremiah actually used. Because I'm telling you, he's not just angry at God, he is raging at God. I'm done. You violated me. We could legitimately translate Jeremiah chapter 20 with the prophet saying, God, you raped me. you have violated me. You called me to be a prophet, and you have abused me by giving me a message of judgment and never following through. These people hate me, and it's because of what you've done. So here's the deal. I'm finished. I'm not preaching anymore. You can find some other stooge. I'm not doing this. Jeremiah chapter 20 is where we get that great phrase that we almost always misinterpret. Jeremiah said, I quit. I'm done. I'm not preaching anymore. But he said a strange thing started to happen. The word of God was like a fire in my bones. Now, I've heard preachers preach that over the years, and they love it. They say, God's called me to preach. He's given me a fire in my bones. Listen, in Jeremiah, that was not a positive thing. He was not saying, I'm charged up, ready to preach. He was saying, I am keeping my mouth shut. I have locked my jaw. I am not doing this anymore. But the word of God that had been given to him was burning from the inside out. And Jeremiah said, as much as I hate this message, I can't help but deliver it. But see, the point is, Jeremiah threw some accusations against God that ought to make us really uncomfortable. You violated me. You raped me. And I hate you for it. Well, guess what happened to God? Nothing. Didn't fall off his throne. Didn't apologize to Jeremiah. He said, Jeremiah, I made you like a potter shapes clay. I made you, and I will use you as I see fit. Now, we might look at that and go, man, God's kind of testy with us. But understand what a privilege it is for God to say, I made you, and even if I've called you to a hard thing, I specifically fashioned you to do this one thing because you are unique and useful to me. Jeremiah finishes better than that moment. He sort of rebounds. It helps that the Babylonians came along and brought judgment, and Jeremiah is finally vindicated. But that's what we have here. We have this man of faith who had such faith in the divine calling of the Hebrew people, in the theocracy or the rule of God, in the wonders of the Pentateuch. His faith was a refusal to accept things the way they were, because it's not supposed to be like this. I wish Christians in America in 2025 would get a little fire in our bellies. We're so afraid of upsetting anybody. We're so afraid of offending people. We're so afraid of causing a little conflict. It's not supposed to be this way. And it's okay for us to say, God, step up. Use us. Find in us useful tools. Because like Israel, in this constant cycle, we are in a season of oppression. And we need you to raise up a judge, a deliverer, because we're not content to hide in our Frady hole and live our lives in this culture because it's not supposed to be this way. What if we could get a little fire in our bellies? It was in faith that a young man dared the displeasure of his father and the anger of the citizens in his village when he cut down that idol in the backyard. It was in faith when he blew the trumpet when the public distress was so extreme that it seemed improbable that he could even get 100 men to join him. It was in faith that he submitted to God reducing his army, first from 32,000 down to 10,000, and then further down to 300. It was in faith that he marched into battle, plunging into the enemy's camp as if into the jaws of death with just 300. Remember, Midian, 135,000. Those are not good odds, except it was Gideon and his 300 and God. His actions were vindicated because God did show up. He did prove himself. And I think at this point, where Gideon is at his pinnacle, he's at his greatest right now on the heels of this victory, on his judicial exercise of judgment against the faithless Israelites, on his execution of the enemy kings. It reminded me of a quote that I've gone back to a number of times in my life. Robert Murray McCheyne was probably the greatest missionary from Scotland in the 19th century. He was asked one time, this story is told in one of his biographies that I've read. He was asked one time what he considered to be the greatest wonder in the world. He thought for a little bit, and then he replied, some might say creation, but it's not creation. Some might say redemption, but I don't think it's even redemption. He said, for me, the greatest wonder in the world is that God goes on bothering with a man like me. Gideon at his pinnacle was a man who was so impressed not with himself, but with his God, that he lived his life with actions that put God on display. Oh, how I wish the story ended here. We've been looking at this series, so a preview for next week. We're going to look at the decline of a leader. But I think Samuel gave us even that part because it's a lesson that all of us need to pay attention to. Father, thank you so much for your word. Every time we find ourselves in your word, we are reminded that you are gracious to your people, that you have made it possible for us to have lives of meaning and significance. You created each one of us precisely to be useful to you. And so, Lord, having watched Gideon over these 5 lessons, I pray that you would allow us to not lose sight of his victories, even as we have to come and consider his failures. Lord, let that be a reminder to us that even our failures are not the final word in our lives, but that you have a plan to accomplish great things and to secure a faith that you started and that you've promised that you will finish. Father, thank you for the privilege of being a follower of Jesus Christ. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.